So here we are at the finish of the Vince McMahon Netflix docuseries, and the episode is also called The Finish, akin to a pro wrestling term, also called the finish, the finish of the match, the finishing move. And yeah, here we go. The sixth episode, and these whole six episodes have been a very wild ride. And I just want to start off with saying I think it was overall a pretty good documentary. I feel like they could have focused on Vince McMahon a bit more. I just feel like there was a bit of a over glorification of each era in the WWE. The Attitude, Ruthless Aggression, PG. It was fun to watch these eras back in the day, but I just feel this was a Vince McMahon documentary, and they focused on those eras a bit much, I found. But, I feel like maybe Netflix was saving face a bit since they're starting a broadcast with WWE in 2025, January. They're going to start broadcasting Raw, and that might have libraries of older Raws, or maybe even more WWE clips and libraries like Peacock and the WWE Network is doing. So I could totally see why Netflix is doing it from a business perspective. I just wish there was more Vince McMahon in this actual documentary. But anyways, let's start off with this breakdown of episode 6 to finish. And we have it starting off with Vince's feud with Trump at WrestleMania 23, I believe it was, and how it did huge business. It then talks about Vince showing up less and less in the 2000s, kind of sporadic appearances. And then there was that whole big angle of Vince McMahon getting into the limo. The limo exploded, and then WWE treated that like a real thing on the website. The commentators were treating it like real too. Some fans even believed it as well. And yeah, pretty crazy angle. And then as that angle is happening, that's when the Chris Benoit incident also happened, and it put a whole stop to that. If you don't know who Chris Benoit is, he was a longtime pro wrestler, mostly for WCW, but he also went to the WWE after. Then he became champion, and Chris was really known for his technical skills and ability, fast twitch wrestling style. He was honestly very entertaining to watch, and his matches were super good. But in 2007, he then killed his wife, his son, and himself. And when this happened, you had news outlets blaming steroids, saying roid rage, drug abuse, etc. You then have Bret Hart on screen saying steroids don't do that, and other wrestlers back it up too. But to be honest, there is some evidence online and statements from people that say that steroids cause anger issues and other effects. So there is that, depending on the type of testosterone and things you're taking in the doses, of course. But despite all that, the real notion is that Chris had brain damage from all the concussions that he suffered throughout his pro wrestling career. Now this then leads to something called CTE, which is basically a degenerative brain disease. And there are notable other people, like in the NFL, if you remember Aaron Hernandez, he was diagnosed with CTE, and he had crazy paranoia, mood swings. He eventually was arrested for first-degree murder. So there's that. So let's turn back to Benoit. His brain was scanned by a study done by Chris Nowinski, who was also a wrestler for WWE, and Nowinski's career ironically ended by concussions, so he opened a kind of concussion foundation, so to speak, and he was granted to scan Chris Benoit's brain by his father after he passed away. So he scanned Chris Benoit's brain, and after the scan, he found that the brain of Chris Benoit was the same as a brain as an 80-year-old man with Alzheimer's disease. Now that is some deep freaking stuff, man. We then cut to Stone Cold Steve Austin, who's talking about how he's only had one concussion throughout his whole career. Lucky him, right? And he says if you're a safe worker, you won't get concussions. But then here's the kicker. Despite all that, he says he's not a CTE guy, and he doesn't believe in it. I mean, come on. There is clear evidence online in scientific journals, studies, that CTE actually exists. You could go out there and Google it yourself. There's endless evidence online. So for Steve to say he's not a CTE guy and he doesn't believe in it, it's one thing. You don't have to be a CTE guy and know about it. But if you actually spend some time to study about it, you would know that it's an actual legit thing. So anyways, after the Benoit incident, we have lots of news outlets wanting to talk to WWE about the roid abuse, drugs, and etc. So we actually have Vince McMahon agreeing to do a face-to-face interview, and this subject is about the deaths in pro wrestling and why does it happen to so many young people like Eddie Guerrero, British Bulldog, all these WWE stars passing away under the age of 50 in many cases. So the interview guy's asking Vince about these deaths and if they fall on his shoulders in any shape or form. And Vince McMahon just denies it. He says, no, I don't take accountability for that. I don't believe I'm responsible for them dying. I don't think it falls on my shoulders in any shape or form. And as he's saying that, he notices that the interviewer's face is kind of changing emotionally. And Vince McMahon's like, oh, you want to make that kind of face? And the interview guy's like holding the paper in his hand, like with all the evidence of these wrestlers. And then Vince McMahon slaps the papers almost out of the guy's hands, like pretty aggressively. So he's basically transitioning into the Mr. McMahon character, during that interview. It's pretty crazy how all that shit hits the fan, and I found it, laughable, but also kind of scary at the same time because it was a serious interview and Vince just turns into Mr. McMahon and who's who at this point, right? So there's another tidbit on concussions, and it's when The Undertaker lost to Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania 30. And it ended his WrestleMania winning streak at that point. I think he had over 20 wins at that point. Huge WrestleMania winning streak. But Taker says he was concussed 5 minutes into that match, and that's why he doesn't remember most of it. But Vince McMahon says, no, that can't be it. It was most likely the psychological shock that The Undertaker had to lose his winning streak at WrestleMania. That's why he probably forgot the whole match. The documentary then goes on to talk about how WWE transitioned into the PG era, a more cleaner product with more sponsors, which meant less violence and things of that nature. And many attitude and ruthless aggression fans were upset about this, including myself. I had many other friends and people I spoke with online that were upset about, the PG era and how watered things down were basically. But then again, business was still hot and they had more sponsors, more money, so it is what it is kind of deal, you know what I mean? So then Netflix touches on the women's revolution and the Give Divas a Chance movement. Now, this is all great in hindsight, but again, it seems like an over-glorification of the WWE rather than focusing on the subject of this documentary, and that is Vince McMahon. So then we finally get to some good stuff again, with Shane McMahon returning to the WWE in 2016. And he returned to a huge pop. Vince says he's going to put him through a match, and he says he's going to put him through a fucking beating. And that's not censored, by the way, in the documentary. I love how we get those little moments in the PG era where you hear like an F-bomb or something like that. So Shane then has a crazy match with The Undertaker at WrestleMania 32 in Hell in a Cell. And he performs a crazy spot there, as always. Shane jumps from the top of the cell doing like a friggin' elbow drop Taker moves, Shane goes through the table. And that was Shane's narrative throughout all these years, doing these crazy high spots. You know, he had the match with Kurt Angle, where he got like thrown through the glass at King of the Ring. Then he jumped off the Titantron at Backlash. So Shane has put his body through so much just to prove something to his father. And then we go backstage after the match with Taker at WrestleMania 32. And this is a really touching moment. We have Shane get a really nice long hug from Vince McMahon. And it's a really long, emotional one. You could see Vince tearing up at one point. And while this is happening, Shane is whispering in Vince's ear, "That's all I ever wanted, was your respect." And it was a really beautiful moment. And you could tell it's something that Shane didn't really get over the years. We then cut back to the Netflix interview, and they're interviewing Vince McMahon, and he says he'll never, ever retire. But this is when we finally get to the allegations of the summer of 2022. Now at this point, we only have like about 30 to 40 minutes left in the whole documentary, which kind of sucks, but it is what it is. So as Vince McMahon hears that news about the allegations in the summer of 2022, guess what he does? He retires. Ironic, I know. So then his daughter, Stephanie McMahon, takes over as the CEO of WWE, and then her husband, Paul Triple H Levesque, is head of creative. So he's writing all the storylines. So they're basically running the company together, kind of like the McMahon-Helmsley era in 2000 WWF. Like that storyline has come full circle in 2022. So I found that pretty sweet and cool. So after all these allegations are made public, Netflix hasn't finished interviewing Vince McMahon yet. But of course, he cancels the remainder of his interviews as all this shit hits the fan, if you know what I mean. So Vince McMahon actually ends up still showing up on SmackDown on screen in the summer of 2022 after all the allegations and everything is made public. He feels like he has to make one more appearance to the WWE universe or whatever, just to say his piece on the microphone. He throws the microphone away, and that was kind of our goodbye to Vince McMahon, Mr. McMahon, whatever the hell you want to call him. So after all this happens, the allegations, he says goodbye, all that, Vince McMahon still has a huge amount of control and stock with the company behind the scenes. So he's still kind of pulling the strings behind the guise of Stephanie and Triple H. So that all happened. Steph and Triple H are running it through the summer of 2022, the fall, the winter, etc. But then at the end of 2022, Vince McMahon is starting to make his way back in the WWE, or at least he's trying, because he wants to maneuver a sale of the WWE. So as all this is happening, Vince McMahon ends up trying to come back, and the board of directors are voting against it. Basically, Stephanie and Triple H are on the board of directors, and they're voting against Vince coming back. But the thing about Vince, he has majority control of the company and the board. So Vince McMahon just ends up voting himself back in. And as Vince McMahon comes in, Stephanie McMahon, his daughter, resigns from the company at the same exact time. Coincidence? I think not. So Stephanie quits, she says goodbye, and then Vince McMahon ends up selling WWE to Endeavor, which is led by his buddy Ari Emanuel. Another coincidence? I think not. So Endeavor then forms TKO Group, and TKO Group is a parent to the UFC and WWE. And now Vince has 49% control of the company. So he's chairman, but he only has 49% control of the company. So he doesn't have that leverage that he did before, basically. So as more shit hits the fan with these allegations and lawsuits, we then have text messages revealed of Vince McMahon and Janelle Grant, the person, the victim of this summer of 2022 lawsuit. So she reveals screenshots of the text messages. She then reveals that Vince McMahon used sex toys on her, and he named the sex toys after certain wrestlers based on the colors of the sex toys and things like that. And then on top of that, with the cherry on top, but it's not a cherry on top, we have defecation from Vince McMahon on top of all that. Yeah, I want to take a shower too, believe me, this is pretty disgusting. So we have the literal shit hitting the fan, and at this point, there's no other choice to make. TKO has to force Vince McMahon out of the company, and he can't do anything about it because he only has that less than half control, right? So Vince McMahon is finally forced to resign at that point, and we say goodbye to Mr. McMahon. So now Triple H is in full force. He's the face of the company. He's running creative, head of talent relations, and wrestlers, they just seem to be in a better place. Company morale is up. And then we had Stephanie McMahon return on screen at WrestleMania 40 a few months ago. So she's back on screen and she seems in a good place as well. But as all this goes down, we still have Vince McMahon in the background fighting those lawsuits. He's not giving up. Vince McMahon is a fighter, and he's the type of guy that needs something to do. He needs to fight. He needs that enemy against his game plan, his own narrative. So Vince McMahon won't give up. He'll always fight. He's living up to that character that he's played, that he's been for the past few decades. And that's just how he is. If you ask me if I think we'll ever see Vince McMahon in the WWE ever again, I would say all answers point to no. We could quote his own theme song, "No Chance in Hell." And that's what I think of that. But, the thing with Vince McMahon, you never know. We may not have seen the last of Vincent Kennedy McMahon. And that is truly a very scary thing to say, especially after everything we've learned over these past few years. So thanks for watching me review this Vince McMahon Netflix docuseries. It's been a pretty big emotional roller coaster for me to dive deep into the universe of Vince McMahon and everything that surrounds him. I think I'll always be a pro wrestling fan, but I would be lying to say that this hasn't tainted my experience, everything that we've learned over these past couple of years. But I would also be lying if I said that I didn't appreciate the memories that Vince McMahon has given us over these past decades too. There's been a lot of good moments in pro wrestling, Attitude Era, Ruthless Aggression, and so on that Vince McMahon has created. So it's kind of a catch-22 in some ways. You know what I mean? But that's it. Thank you so much for watching. If you could like this video, I would appreciate it a ton if you found it informative or entertaining in any way. It helps the engagement and helps my channel get out there. You could even dislike it if you want as well. That's cool with me. And also feel free to drop some comments below. We could chat in the comments section about the docuseries or anything WWE related. And that's it for this one. Y'all have a good one. Stay safe and try to stay sane after watching this thing. I'll try my best as well. And I'll see y'all later. Peace out.